I always thought I lived in the perfect home. A spacious apartment in one of the tallest skyscrapers in the city, with panoramic windows through which, no matter the weather, there was a view of the bustling city, living its own life. Inside, everything was in its place. A luxurious kitchen where, of course, I hardly ever cooked because Robert often ordered food for delivery, and a cozy living room with a soft sofa, where I loved just sitting, looking out the window and listening to the silence. All these details came together to form the perfect picture. I often thought that this place was the true embodiment of success, calm and stability. Everything was fine. And it seemed for someone this would be enough to feel truly happy. But in recent months, I felt that something inside me had started to change. At first, I couldn't understand exactly what it was. Everything outside remained in its place. Nothing seemed different, but deep down, something was off. At first, I thought I was just going through a period of fatigue, that it was just a temporary eclipse, something that would pass. But the more I tried to convince myself, the clearer it became. This was not just tiredness. It was something deeper. Even in this perfectly organized home, which seemed to symbolize stability, I started feeling emptiness, as if something was missing at its very core. The view from the window no longer brought joy, and the familiar sounds in the apartment started to irritate me. I found myself thinking more and more often that my life had come to a dead end. But something in that dead end kept me there. Robert's words, his silence, his habit of working late. All of this prevented me from fully realizing that something was happening. We didn't talk. We existed side by side, but no longer the way we used to. These feelings had no explanation. Maybe it wasn't the house itself, but rather that something was missing in my life. I didn't understand what it was, but I felt how an invisible emptiness was expanding, pulling me in. One morning, when I went for a walk with Jack, our beagle, I noticed a new neighbor. We often walked in the park near our home, and everything here used to be familiar and routine. But today, something was different. Jack and I, as usual, were walking down the alley when our eyes met a man standing by his car, unloading boxes. He was tall, tanned, wearing a white shirt with a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his face. His confidence was so natural that I immediately felt how it reflected on me. He noticed us, and I couldn't help but approach. Jack wagged his tail, sensing we weren't stopping for no reason. "Hi," he said when I approached. "Looks like your dog couldn't wait a minute longer for a walk." His voice was calm and pleasant, with no tension, as if we'd known each other for years. I couldn't help but smile. "Yeah," I replied. "He's always like this. I think he cares more about the walk than I do." He laughed, and something in that laughter immediately dispelled any thoughts I had that this man might be strange or unusual. We talked a little about our dogs. He told me he had just moved in and was trying to settle into the new neighborhood. It was such an ordinary conversation, but for me it became something more. I felt a strange relief from how easily our words flowed, as if it was something long forgotten. Jason, as he introduced himself, was an extraordinarily pleasant person. It was easy to talk to him, and I suddenly realized how long it had been since I'd had this kind of conversation. Simple, human, without any hidden motives or tension. We parted at the edge of the park, but his presence lingered with me. I noticed that something inside me had slightly stirred, something I couldn't immediately understand. Now, it seemed like a small thing, a casual meeting with a new neighbor. But at that moment, I felt how something had begun to change. When I returned home, Robert was still in his office, absorbed in his work as usual. It had become so routine that I no longer found it surprising. We hardly talked, and honestly, I couldn't even say when was the last time we had a real conversation. We talked about everyday things, what we bought at the store, the schedule, how the day went. But there was nothing genuine in those conversations, no sincerity. I sat on the sofa and turned on the TV, but I wasn't really watching. Thoughts of Jason and our conversation came back to me again. I tried to understand what that was. Why had it affected me so much? But something about that conversation wouldn't let me go. Robert had been traveling more often for work or staying late at the office. He was consumed by his business, his tasks, while I remained in this empty apartment that no longer seemed as cozy and comfortable as it used to. I found it difficult to understand what was happening between us. He was there, but it felt like he wasn't. I tried to get up from the sofa and do something that would distract me from these thoughts, but the more I tried to fill the emptiness, the more I clearly felt its presence. The thoughts that something was wrong became more persistent. I tried to tell myself that it was just temporary, that such moments happen in life, and they would pass. But they didn't pass. Every time I saw Robert, his eyes were tired, his words short. He continued to work as usual, but I could no longer understand what was really behind his gaze. I began to feel that it wasn't just our home that had changed, but that something inside me was beginning to change too. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, as usual, I decided to go for a walk with Jack. The parks had become my refuge, a place where I could, at least for a while, forget about everything that was happening in the apartment. We walked along the familiar paths, and although the air was fresh and the sun gently warmed the earth, inside me I felt uneasy. Everything seemed somehow unreal, too quiet. When we approached one of the alleys, I noticed Jay. He was sitting on a bench and his dog, another beagle, was running around wagging its tail. When he saw us, he stood up and waved. "Hi, we keep running into each other. Jack looks as energetic as ever." I smiled, though I felt a little shy. It was strange to talk to him so easily, but on the other hand, I felt how it lifted my mood. "Yeah, he never slows down," I replied, a bit embarrassed, but still feeling the tension begin to ease. We sat down together on the bench, and our dogs started playing with each other. We talked about our pets, how they sometimes surprised us with their little mischiefs. It was so natural, so effortless. Jay talked about how his beagle always dug holes in the garden, and I shared how Jack had learned to bring me my slippers. But there was something more in these simple conversations. I didn't know why, but I felt lighter. It was as if just being around this person, laughing and sharing small joys, was something I had been missing. When we parted ways, I thought about it for a long time. He was just a neighbor, just an acquaintance, but strangely, I felt that our encounters had become something important to me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a pleasant interaction, nothing more. But deep inside, the thought was growing. Maybe I needed more of these moments. Maybe I was missing something simple and real that I couldn't find with Robert. With that question in my mind, I returned home, but something inside me had already changed. In the evening, sitting at dinner, I tried to focus on Robert. He was tired again, once more absorbed in his work. I tried to keep the conversation going, but our topics increasingly turned to mundane questions, like who bought the milk and when we were planning to go on vacation. Everything was as it always was, familiar and safe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't what I truly wanted. Robert was talking about work, and I kept thinking about our park, about Jason, about how naturally our conversations had flowed. When I tried to bring my thoughts back to reality, realizing that my life in this apartment still seemed somehow ordered, I couldn't get rid of the sense of emptiness I had overlooked all these years. I thought maybe what I was missing was genuine communication, those simple moments, like with Jason, that made me feel alive. Perhaps it didn't really matter, and these feelings were just part of the routine of life. I wasn't sure. But somehow, each time I thought about those encounters, it became harder to ignore the growing sense of dissatisfaction. With each passing day, Robert became more distant. He rarely looked me in the eye, often absorbed in his work or simply sitting in his office. I couldn't understand where all of this had begun. When did we stop? When did I start living with this feeling that things weren't the same as before? It seemed like we had both forgotten how to look at each other, how to talk about what truly mattered, not just about what was necessary. I decided to go for a walk with Jack without telling Robert where I was going or why. Walks had become my only time when I could be alone with myself, with thoughts that didn't go away. When I stepped out of the building, there was something light and fresh in the air, but what was inside me didn't feel light anymore. I couldn't push away thoughts of Jason, of how peaceful and comfortable I felt in his company, how I had somehow started to feel like myself again. not just a part of some mechanism. I walked through the streets and suddenly I realized that my steps were leading me more and more often to places where I might run into him. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was happening on its own. I didn't know what to do with it, but all these encounters were beginning to form something more. I returned home late in the evening. As I entered the apartment, I noticed that Robert had gone on another business trip. He had been away so often that his absence no longer caused me any concern. On the contrary, it had become a part of my life. Thoughts of Jason, our conversations and meetings returned to me once again. I dropped my bag on the table and walked to the window, as usual, to look at the city, which so strongly attracted me with its constantly moving life, almost in contrast to the stagnation I felt within my apartment. Everything was calm, as usual, and I just needed a bit of silence to process everything that was going on in my mind. I didn't know why, but at that moment, I felt the urge to go to the park, to walk down the same alleys where Jason and I had met. It felt unusual, not just a walk with Jack, but a deliberate step in search of something I couldn't quite understand. I was about to put on my jacket and head out when I suddenly realized that it was already late. But that didn't stop me. I left the house and headed toward the park, feeling the internal tension ease slightly as I stepped outside. Walks had become my small escapes, moments when I could stop thinking about what was going on around me and just walk. And then, suddenly, I saw him. Jason was sitting on the bench, his beagle next to him. It was the same bench where we had sat the day before. I froze for a moment because I hadn't expected to find him here, at this time. He looked up and noticed me. He smiled. "Hi, we meet again," he said, standing up. "I didn't expect you to be out so late. Everything all right?" I couldn't hide my smile, feeling how my inner world suddenly filled with warmth. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just felt like going for a walk." I took a step toward him and sat on the bench. "How was your day?" We started talking as if nothing had changed, and yet there was something different about this conversation compared to all our previous encounters. We weren't talking about anything important, but it was easy. In his company, I felt like I could be myself. He looked at me as if noticing something he hadn't seen before, and quietly said, "You come here often, don't you? I think you really like this place." I nodded slightly, not knowing what to say. There was something in that simple question that made me pause. Yes, I did like this park, but I wasn't sure if the reason was simply to walk the dog. It had become a symbol of something bigger that I couldn't understand. That moment was fleeting, but in it, I felt that everything was changing. And I was afraid of how this was starting to affect me. After that meeting with Jason, I couldn't shake the thought of how he made me see my life from a different perspective. We continued to meet, walking the dogs, and these walks became something more meaningful to me than just exchanging pleasantries. Every word, every glance in his direction left behind the feeling that something was changing. I would return home and try to find the strength within myself to explain what was happening. But the more I tried to push my thoughts away, the more I realized that I couldn't ignore what was going on inside me. I started to notice how much of what I had once considered important now seemed insignificant. Robert continued with his usual routine, absorbed in work, his gaze more and more vacant, his words distant. He didn't ask questions, didn't care about what was happening in my life. It was easy with him, but there was something painful about it, because I felt his absence not in the sense that he wasn't physically around, but because he was so emotionally distant. It was as if we were both living parallel lives, never touching each other. But with each passing day, I was drawn more and more to Jason. His presence became some sort of anchor for me, though I couldn't quite understand what it really meant. Why him? Why had our conversations become so important to me? It was something new and fresh, something I hadn't felt in a long time. When I talked to him, I felt like something inside me was coming alive. I started to notice how he genuinely cared about me, my thoughts and feelings. In his gaze, there was none of the alienation I felt when I looked at Robert. And at that moment, I suddenly realized that maybe I was seeking something more in Jason than just conversations about dogs and everyday trivialities. Maybe I was looking for someone who truly noticed me, someone who saw me, and not just the empty shell I had become around Robert. But I still didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't answer myself what I was feeling, what this attachment was, or how it would change my life. But one thing was clear. I could no longer live in the reality that had once seemed so familiar to me. Jason had become something important to me, and I couldn't pretend anymore that nothing was happening. Despite all my efforts to prevent my steps from leading me to Jason, I couldn't stop myself. With each passing day, my walks became more frequent, and encounters with him, inevitable. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking that I was walking to places where I knew I could run into him. Without any real reason, just because. And every time I saw him, I felt a strange inner relief, as if something that had been out of place suddenly became right. I tried to avoid these meetings, telling myself that I needed time for myself, that I was simply walking with Jack. But something about it pulled me in, like a magnet. His presence had become an inseparable part of my day. His ease in conversation, the genuine interest and attention he showed me, created the feeling that I wasn't completely lost in this world. With him, I felt alive again. Important, not hidden in the shadows of my own disappointments. The more I tried to avoid meeting him, the more often they happened. We would run into each other in the park, on walks, on weekends. He was always around, as if the universe itself was pushing us toward each other. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. He had become a part of my world, and despite my fear of admitting it to myself, I was beginning to like it. I went back inside, but this time, even before I opened the door, I felt that something had changed. It became heavy inside me. I knew Robert wouldn't be coming home tonight. His business trip had been extended. I realized I would be alone at home, and it no longer felt like such a safe place. Was it the loneliness that scared me most? Or was it the empty space I had filled with something else? I walked through the apartment, looking at the familiar things, but they now seemed foreign to me. Everything was mixing together in my mind. Robert's words, conversations with Jason, my attempts not to think about what was happening. I felt like I was at a crossroads, and I couldn't figure out what to do. When I stepped outside again, it became clear to me. My steps were more and more often leading me to places where I could see him, where I could feel the ease that vanished the moment I returned home. A strange, anxious fire was burning inside me. I was afraid of what this might mean, but I couldn't stop myself from wanting to see him again. One day, Robert returned home earlier than usual. I wasn't expecting this, and when the door opened, I looked up from the book I was reading in surprise. Robert looked tired, as always, but something in his gaze made me feel that he had noticed the changes. "Hi," he said, shrugging off his jacket. "You're probably surprised I'm home so early." I nodded, unsure of what to say. He stood in the hallway as if listening for something, trying to catch an invisible shift in the air. "Is something wrong?" he asked, finally taking off his shoes and heading toward the kitchen. "Are you hiding something?" I felt a sharp pang in my chest. What could I say to him? I knew that changes were happening in my life, that I felt more and more distance between us. But how could I explain this to Robert without disrupting the fragile harmony that had existed between us for the last few years? I thought that maybe he sensed something was wrong, but couldn't pinpoint what exactly. And perhaps his questions were an attempt to hold me back, to prevent these changes from unfolding. But how could I explain to him that I couldn't stay in this emptiness? How could I tell him that my thoughts had long been occupied by other things, and I couldn't just keep living as I had before? "It's fine," I answered, trying to sound confident. "Just a little tired. Getting used to your business trips." It was almost the truth. But inside, I felt how the words couldn't hide what was really happening. Robert looked concerned, but didn't press further. He simply nodded and went back to his office. I felt how difficult it became to breathe in this apartment. When he left, I was alone in the empty room. I thought about how I could explain everything to him, but I immediately realized that it wouldn't happen. With each passing day, the distance between us became more and more apparent, and in my thoughts, the image of Jason began to appear more frequently. Robert didn't even ask me how my day went, what I was feeling, or what was bothering me. He didn't notice me, and perhaps that was the main issue. He hadn't noticed me for a long time. The next morning, as I walked down the street, it suddenly became clear to me that everything had changed. I met Jason in the park. We talked about the dogs, as usual, but this time something in his voice and gaze made me stop and think. He didn't ask about Robert or my home, as someone else might have done. He simply asked, "How are you feeling?" It was such a simple question, but I felt it penetrate deep inside me, uncovering something important that I hadn't been able to speak about, even to myself, for a long time. I didn't answer immediately because in that moment, I realized that the questions he asked and his attention, that was what I had been missing for so long. Robert no longer asked me those kinds of questions. I had become used to the silence, the emptiness that filled everything around us. But with Jason, it was different. His presence was simple, but there was more in it than I had expected. I felt something inside me ignite, something I had been trying not to think about. We talked a little more, but I noticed how my attention was diverted, not so much to the conversation, but to how much I wanted this moment to continue. I wanted Jason to stay, for us to keep walking, laughing, and talking about whatever was on our minds at that moment. I didn't want to go back home, to the empty apartment where Robert probably wouldn't even notice that I had arrived. When we said goodbye, I felt a strange mix of relief and fear within me. I couldn't explain to myself what was happening, but at some point, I realized that everything I had thought about my life was now in question. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, I knew that Jason had already become an important part of my days. And there was something both powerful and frightening about it. He returned to his dog and I headed home. But this time, I didn't feel that usual calm. I could no longer just keep living the way I had before. Now, I was facing a choice, and I knew that I couldn't run from it. No matter how hard I tried to hold on to what had been, inside me, a new reality was beginning to grow. One where I could no longer hide my feelings and desires. I sensed that maybe this moment had become a turning point. And now, I had to figure out what I was going to do with it. That evening, when I returned home, I felt that the time had come. Robert wasn't there, and the apartment once again filled with the emptiness that now seemed almost unbearable. I sat on the couch, hugging my knees, and thought about how long I had hidden my feelings from everyone. From Robert, from myself. But now, I understood that I could no longer keep living in this state. I couldn't close my eyes to what was happening. I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine. With each passing day, Jason became more important to me. His presence in my life began to feel like something essential, like the air I had long overlooked, only to suddenly realize that I couldn't breathe without it. His sincerity, attention, even those brief conversations about dogs, all of this was exactly what I had been missing. I felt how his image had become an inseparable part of my day, and thoughts of him had become a part of my life. When Robert returned, I was ready to talk to him. We sat down for dinner, and I knew I had to say something. It hurt, but I couldn't pretend anymore that everything would be fine when, in reality, everything had long been wrong. "Robert," I began, and his eyes lifted to meet mine. "I don't know how to say this, but you need to understand. I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep hiding what's happening in my life and in my head. I don't feel connected to you. We've lost something important a long time ago, and I can't go back." He was silent, as always. His gaze turned cold, his body tensed. I felt that every word was causing him pain, but perhaps this was the only way to free us both. "I've met someone else," I continued, feeling everything inside me tighten. "And he's become important to me. I don't know what will happen next, but I can't keep living in this emptiness. I can't keep hiding what I feel." Robert put down his spoon and looked at me carefully. We sat in silence for several minutes. He didn't say a word, but I saw in his eyes the same emptiness I had felt in myself all this time. He knew it had come. I could see it in his reaction. In that moment, I realized that this was my choice, and I could no longer go back. I left Robert, leaving behind everything that had once seemed stable and right. I didn't know what would happen next, but I could no longer stay in the life that had been built for me. My steps, now more decisive, led me into a new, unknown life. I didn't know where it would take me, but I could no longer remain in that cage. I chose to be honest with myself, and perhaps that was all I needed to move forward. Jason was by my side, and although we didn't know what would happen with us tomorrow, I felt that this step had become the beginning of something new, something I needed to experience to understand what it meant to be myself. After I left Robert, I felt a mix of emotions, relief and uncertainty. I no longer felt attached to the empty, cold apartment, but at the same time, I was still confused, not knowing what awaited me ahead. I couldn't exactly say what I wanted, but I knew I had to take that step to at least feel like I was truly living. In the first few days, I went through a whirlwind of emotions. I was afraid of being alone. The familiar routine was gone. The long hours on the couch, cooking experiments in the kitchen, even the silent conversations with Robert. Everything disappeared, and I had to relearn how to structure my day. But in those days, filled with emptiness, a new bright spot appeared. Jason. I hadn't expected him to become so important to me. He was there, supporting me but not pressuring me. His presence had become a natural continuation of what had started back in the park. We talked about life, about what concerned us, laughed, and sometimes just sat in silence. But that silence was different, calm and unstrained. One day, during a walk, when we sat on that same bench, Jason looked at me and said, "I'm glad you decided to do what you feel. I know it wasn't easy, but you did it, and that's important." I didn't know how to respond because in that moment, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for having him by my side, for him not setting any conditions, not trying to guide me, but simply supporting me. He was the kind of person with whom I could be myself, without the fear of being judged. Time passed, and I began to feel that I wasn't afraid of my freedom. I no longer had to explain myself to anyone or justify my actions. I was alone, but not lonely. This path was mine, and I chose how to walk it. I found new hobbies, new interests, started meeting friends I hadn't seen in a long time, and rediscovered the joy in simple things. I didn't know what would happen with Jason. With us? Maybe we would remain friends, maybe our relationship would grow into something more. But at that moment, I understood one thing. I had found the freedom that allowed me to be real, to feel, and to live without compromises. I realized that everything that had happened in my life had led me to this moment, and I was ready to see what would come next. With every step I took into this new life, I felt more and more how the things I had lost long ago, confidence in myself, the desire to move forward and live the way I truly wanted, were coming back to life. And with every new day, every new conversation with Jason, I felt how this new beginning was becoming more and more real, while the old doubts faded away. With each day, as I woke up in my new life, I felt more and more how it was filling with meaning. No more rushing in the morning. No more conversations with Robert that dragged on into an abyss of silence. Now, the morning began with simple decisions. What to wear, where to go, what to do. Everything felt new and liberating. I could choose without looking back at others' expectations or habits. However, as time passed, I began to notice that while freedom brought relief, it also carried with it a sense of uncertainty. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Jason had certainly become an important person in my life, but we didn't discuss what was happening between us. Sometimes it felt like we were both afraid to look too far ahead, as if we weren't ready to label the relationship that was still developing. I continued to go to the places where we often met, and from time to time we spent evenings together again, talking on the bench in the park, walking the dogs, which sometimes turned into discussions about life. But the next day, I was alone again. We didn't try to deepen our relationship or put labels on it. It was as if we both understood that, for now, We just needed to be there, to be honest with ourselves. Sometimes it became difficult to bear the feeling that in this uncertainty, we were both stuck. On one of those evenings, sitting on the bench, Jason seemed to sense that I was thinking about something deep, and he asked me, "Are you afraid? Of something new? Something unclear?" I looked at him, at his calm face, and felt my shoulders relax. I nodded silently. Yes, I was afraid. Fearful of getting lost in something without clear boundaries, I had been trying to understand and control everything, always searching for something that would give me certainty. But Jason smiled and said, "Sometimes in life, it's important to just keep going. And you don't always need to know what's around the corner. The most important thing is to walk and believe that you are choosing this path." His words resonated deeply in my soul. I began to realize that in my life, not everything had to be carefully planned. This was what I had been searching for. Not control, but the ability to trust the process, to be open to whatever the future brought, not to fear the unknown.